Chapter 4 of Mounted Police Life in Canada. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Mounted Police Life in Canada by Captain Burton Dean. Chapter 4, 1886 to 88, Regina. Mr. Lawrence Herchmer duly presented himself at the office of the Commissioner of the North West Mounted Police on the morning of the 1st April, 1885. Colonel Irvine was not there to receive him, as he had started off 2 or 3 days previously to Macleod, without having said a word, even to me, about his supersession. I had, however, by that time become quite used to the eccentricities of the Mounted Police Force, and informed the new Commissioner that, in my opinion, he need not expect his predecessor to hand over his command in person. Mr. Herchmer therefore sent telegrams to the officers commanding the various posts, saying that he assumed the commissionership from that day, and that in future all official correspondence should be addressed to himself at Regina. Having done that, he went back to Government House, where he was staying for the time being. In the evening a farewell order was received by wire from Colonel Irvine, and was duly published in General Orders. Among the telegrams sent by Mr. Herchmer on his arrival was one to his brother, the superintendent in command at Calgary, desiring him to come to headquarters for, as he said, "I don't know how my brother may take my appointment." The brother, however, could never have been fool enough to think that he was in the running for Colonel Irvine's vacancy, and so there need have been no anxiety on that score. He came readily enough in answer to the summons, and the first object to which they gave their minds was the breaking up of what they called the Macleod clique. The officer commanding the police post at Macleod at the time, that is, Superintendent John Cotton, my predecessor in the adjutancy, had always objected to the transfer of the police headquarters to Regina from Port Walsh, a point which was much further westward, but had nothing to recommend it, as far as I could see, beyond its old association, etc. The climate was, it must be confessed, very much less severe than that of Regina, but the post itself was situated in a flat entirely at the mercy of rifle fire from surrounding hills. It was here that Sitting Bull, with his victorious band of Sioux Indians, had presented themselves after their massacre of the American troops under General Custer, and naturally some allowance might be made for the sake of old associations, but they could not necessarily be allowed to militate against the deliberate decision of the Government, which was to place the headquarters of the Mounted Police at Regina, the capital of the North West Territories, where indeed it would be most convenient. Regina, be it noted, was the choice of Lieutenant Governor Dewdney, and was christened by the Princess Louise. Mr. Dewdney had been severely criticised for selecting such a spot for a capital, and I was shown an old American map, wherein the settlement, for it was neither village nor municipality in those days, did unquestionably appear within the apex of a district delineated on the map as the Great American Desert. All I can say is that it is a pretty fortunate desert to have such soil as it has, deep, rich and heavy, which will be able to grow wheat and other cereals when less favoured localities will be played out, as some of them are now already. I know something of the Regina soil, for, with the exception of that at Government House, I made probably the first garden in the place. A good garden it was too, though it was made within 10 days in the spring of 1884. It is an historical fact that in 1886, when Sir John and Lady Macdonald paid their first visit to Western Canada, I sent to Government House in time for their breakfast a muskmelon which, under glass of course, happened to mature in the nick of time, and was certainly the first of its kind grown within many miles of the spot. It is necessary here to explain that the officer commanding the Mounted Police at Macleod had, until the time of which I write, that is, A.D. 1886, acted also as a collector of customs for the western country. This brought him a good round sum every year, as all the cattle, horses and other dutiable goods which entered the country from the south had to pay duty at Macleod, and the former occupant of the position, during his tenure thereof, had made about $25,000 in addition to his police pay. At Macleod also was stationed Dr. George Kennedy, a great friend of Superintendent John Cotton's, who was the assistant surgeon in medical charge of the post and district, and the only practitioner in the neighbourhood. This was the combination that Herchmer used to call the Macleod clique, and between him and it there was bitter enmity. It goes without saying, therefore, that when the Herchmer family came into power the first sign of attack on the Macleod clique showed itself in orders transferring C Division and its officers to Battleford, a post in the far north about 500 miles from Macleod. Dr. Kennedy said he would not go, and resigned his commission, so that the division went without him and was replaced by the division from Battleford. William Herchmer elected to remain at Calgary, where he was already stationed. The customs appointment at Macleod was doomed to extinction, so far as the police were concerned, for there were many hungry politicians in the East looking for just that kind of job, and the gift was very soon bestowed upon a stalwart of the Conservative party in Ontario. As soon as the newly appointed Commissioner had learnt, as he thought, enough of the rudiments of his new profession to qualify him for the attempt, he started off to make an official inspection of his brother's command at Calgary, by way of practising his prentice hand upon a division which might be expected not to be too critical of his academic methods. E Division fooled him to the top of his bent, and he was delighted with everything he saw. He liked the place, he liked the people, he liked the climate, and as there were lots of trout in the Bow River at the time, some of the men got up early in the morning of his departure and caught some fish, which they packed in ice for him, and sent him home rejoicing. He was as pleased as a child with his new toy, and took an early opportunity after his arrival to unbosom himself to Lieutenant Governor Edgar Dewdney, to whom he imparted his opinion that Calgary would be a preferable place to Regina for the capital of the North West Territories. This was the first intimation that His Honour had that his quondam protégé was now able to sit up and take notice for himself. Meanwhile, life was not too pleasant for me, as Lawrence Herchmer lost no opportunity to vent his spite upon myself. One instance of his methods was exemplified at the time of his departure to make his first inspection at Calgary, as already mentioned. On the morning after he had gone, when I went out into the barrack square, I noticed that the flag was not flying, and, meeting the Sergeant Major, now Colonel R. Belcher, C.M.G. of Strathcona's Horse, I inquired, "What has happened to the flag? Halyards broken?" "No, sir," he replied. "The Commissioner sent for me yesterday and gave me orders that the flag was not to fly when he was out of the post." "Well," I remarked, "he said nothing to me about it, and I saw him last night before he started off for the station." That was just the kind of thing that Mr. Lawrence Herchmer did, and there was a hoot of derision from all over the country at the new rule, which could not be kept secret. I have said enough to show that he was quite an impossible man to work with. His appointments did not bespeak the welfare of the public service as the first consideration. For about a year I fulfilled the duties of my office with scrupulous exactitude, and supplied the many deficiencies in the Commissioner's semi-military education, until on the morning of March 14th, 1887, he overstepped the line of hard and fast demarcation which I had resolutely drawn, and I told him a little of what was in my mind regarding himself and his methods. It happened that the Comptroller of the Force from Ottawa had arrived at Government House on the previous night, and stepped over to the barracks in the morning. He had occasion to pass through my office on his way to see the Commissioner, and as I greeted him I said, "The inevitable row has just occurred. Do not make up your mind until you have heard my side of the story." He nodded and passed on. In a few minutes he came out alone, stopped long enough to say, "Don't let that trouble you, Dean. I quite see how impossible your position is here. I will come over and see you this evening," and wended his way back to Government House. He came to my house soon after 10 that night, and we had a private talk on the existing regime. Daily manifestations of injustice were producing grave discontent. For myself, he said that I had put in 3 years of hard work and should have a rest. He decided to tell the Commissioner in the morning that I should go to the East on recruiting duty for some months, and that thereafter I should be given the command of a post somewhere, possibly at Calgary or Macleod. In pursuance of this arrangement, I left Regina on March 27 with my wife and family for Toronto, which we made our headquarters for the ensuing 4 months, during which time we renewed acquaintance with many old friends there and in Ottawa. On my return I found myself in orders to take command of the Depot Division, to which all recruits were posted, and to which all men at headquarters belonged. This was very much more palatable than resuming my former position in the Commissioner's office. I had dry nursed him for a full year and was heartily sick of the job. During the autumn and winter months I organised a theatrical troupe, and we had considerable fun from our amateur attempts and from little dances that we occasionally gave. We beguiled the time as best we could, for the winter months were long and dreary. We had, of course, sleighing and snowshoeing, but we had no covered skating rink, and it was too cold to skate out of doors. We were, moreover, 2.5 miles from town, so that we had to be self-contained while the thermometer averaged 20 to 25 degrees below zero Fahrenheit, and occasionally dipped into the 30s and 40s. My family and I were always welcome visitors at Government House, for the late Mrs. Dewdney and my late wife were great friends, and we were in no way dependent upon the uncongenial society of the Herchmers, between whom and Government House the rift was gradually but surely widening. It was well understood that the winter of 1887 would be my last in Regina, for the Commissioner had told me on my return from recruiting that I was to take E Division from Calgary to Macleod in the autumn, and although that move had not come off, a transfer to some other post was ahead of me. It was customary at that time for the Commissioner to pay an annual visit to Ottawa during the session of Parliament, so that the Premier might obtain at first hand any information which might be required from the head of the force as to police conditions in the West, and incidentally this gave the visitor an opportunity to do a little lobbying on his own account. Inter alia, movements of officers had to be discussed, and it was therefore without any feeling of surprise that I learned one afternoon from the Lieutenant Governor that he had that morning received a letter from Freddy White, the Comptroller, who told him that it had been decided to transfer me to Prince Albert in the spring. Now Prince Albert was, as I had always understood, a very charming place, a landmark in the country, long before either Regina or Calgary had been thought of. It was one of the old time headquarters of the Hudson's Bay Company, where a chief factor named Lawrence Clark had his habitat, and was altogether a most desirable place to live and work from. It could not, it was true, compete with Regina or Calgary as the metropolis of the North West Territories, but what did that matter? I should be only too glad to go anywhere where my services were required. As to taking my family, that was quite another matter. My wife was inexperienced in prairie travel, so were her 3 younger children, and as there were roughly 300 miles of prairie to be negotiated in wagons in order to reach this delectable spot, it was quite out of the question for me to subject them to that long journey in weather which was as uncertain as the roads, and I decided to send them to Ottawa. In about a fortnight's time the Governor looked me up again, saying that "the Prince Albert deal is off. I have a letter from Fred White in which he says we cannot have her here." I replied, "All right, your Honour, it is all the same to me. Fred White is not such a fool as you think, is he?" He laughed. As my wife and I had spent some months altogether in Ottawa, we were not entirely friendless there. When the Commissioner came home, I learnt that we were to be sent to Lethbridge, so called after the president of the North West Coal and Navigation Company, which company had been opened by Lord Lansdowne in 1885. The police post there had only been completed about a year previously, and the place was still shown on maps as Coal Banks. I wrote to the officer commanding, asking for measurements of his various rooms, etc., and he, poor chap, was quite cut up, for he said he had no previous intimation nor any reason to anticipate a move. He had, as a matter of fact, got into some hot water which had formed the subject of newspaper paragraphs all over the country, and he was moved to Macleod under a senior officer. There was in force in those days a Dominion statute prohibiting the importation, sale, and even the possession of intoxicants by any person within the North West Territories, except by permission of the Lieutenant Governor, and it was the duty of the Mounted Police to enforce this act. When a permit was issued, a notification was sent to the police, and they watched for every consignment, promptly took up each permit, and returned it to the Lieutenant Governor's office. Permits were not altogether easy to obtain, and one uncancelled permit might be used to cover other importations. The suspicion of a permit caused the boys to hang round the Dominion Express office, and wait and wait and watch until at last, after a long time, the express company could be freed to deliver the consignment. Then there would be a gathering of the eagles to the slaughter, and the wagon would be followed to its destination at a discreet distance by all the thirsty harpies who wanted to have a drink at the expense of someone else. If the owner happened to be away from home, the visitors were out of luck, but if, on the other hand, he was there, the entire crowd would follow the keg in and stay with it as long as it contained a drop. This course of action the present-day reader might think would have strained the ties of friendship to the breaking point, but it was not so at all. The generic question of liquor, licit or illicit, was governed by a code of honour all its own. Men whose word in the ordinary transactions of life, always excepting a horse deal, one would accept without reserve, could not be trusted to speak the truth and nothing but the truth where a liquor prosecution was concerned. The first elected Member of Parliament for the Dominion House, when he went north to canvass his constituents in the Edmonton section of Alberta, took with him a sleigh load of carcasses of hogs, and each carcass contained bladders full of whisky, contraband at that, for he never could have obtained permits to cover such an amount as there was, and it had all been smuggled into Macleod from Montana. The half-breed vote might easily be conciliated with whisky, and the candidate was triumphantly returned at the head of the poll. There were at this time men who made their living by dealing in illicit whisky, playing poker, etc., and those who had the wit to take care of their money became well-to-do. Probably the most imprudent theft on a large scale that came under my notice was that of whisky from a carload of liquor which passed through the North West Territories en route to British Columbia, where there was no prohibition law in force. This car was bonded and sealed until it arrived at its destination. It happened, however, that it was side-tracked for a day or two somewhere near Calgary, when the transcontinental train service was in its infancy. In some way the liquor-dealing miscreants had ascertained that the car contained, among the profusion of barrels, kegs and cases that it carried, a barrel of whisky, which stood at a certain spot at its rear end. So, with a long auger, a hole was bored clean through the bottom of the car into the bottom of the barrel, when the rest was easy. They drained the liquor into the receptacles which they had ready, and drove off with the plunder. Obviously, they would not waste time in trying to cover up the traces of their modus operandi, and no clue remained to enable the perpetrators to be identified. When Larry, as he was properly spoken of, returned from Ottawa in the spring of 1888, he was feeling, as the saying is, pretty good, and, with the true Hohenzollern spirit, looked for other worlds to conquer. He had a fine new house waiting for him, a flag that was impatiently longing to fling itself into the breeze, and, taking it all in all, he had every reason to think that it was good to be alive. With the hearty co-operation of his vis a tergo, so christened by Dr. Jukes, he thought out a scheme of officially asking the Lieutenant Governor not to issue any permits to members of the Mounted Police unless the applicants were sent through and were recommended by himself. I had private information as to the receipt of this letter in the Governor's office, and knew also that the Governor took several days to consider the proposition. When he assented, which he finally did, a general order was issued by the Commissioner to the force throughout the country. I was then free to talk to the Governor about this order, and told him frankly that I considered it to be an infringement upon the liberty of the subject, and calculated to bring into disrepute a body of officers without whose co-operation the existing prohibition law could not be enforced. From a personal point of view, I represented that I considered the order an insult. I said to him, "Your Honour is quite well aware that liquor is not abused in my household, whatever may be the case elsewhere." He understood the implication without any further enlargement, and said it was within his personal knowledge that, in some instances, it might not be inadvisable to have the order carried out, but that, so far as I was concerned, he should not think of setting a limit to his own discretion. I might rest assured that he would grant me a permit whenever I might think proper to ask for one. Upon this I simply sat tight, and ignored Mr. Herchmer in the matter of my permits. It was at this juncture that my family and I left Regina for Lethbridge, but it will be convenient to close upon this controversy at this point. Every successive permit that was issued to me threw my domineering friend into a fresh paroxysm of rage, and while he lost his temper I placidly kept mine, and stood my ground. The end of it was that, after the lapse of some weeks, the minister at Ottawa gave instructions that the offending General Order should be cancelled, and a new one issued providing that intoxicating liquors should not be taken into police barracks without the consent of the Commissioner. As this was entirely intra vires of that officer, I cheerfully accepted the conditions during the few years that the prohibition law remained in force. The ramifications of this dispute brought about an entire rupture of the quondam friendship between the Lieutenant Governor and Mr. Herchmer, and they ceased to speak to one another. This was rendered the more easy, so far as the public service was concerned, as the Governor, on the expiration of his term of office in the Territories, carried the constituency of Moosomin, and entered the Cabinet at Ottawa as Minister of the Interior. Chapter 5